In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
To really test long-term whether things have changed are a couple of things. Listen for language. Listen out for what's the chat. Are the words that you're expecting, the tone of the behavior thrown up through that language? Are you hearing it in the corridors or in the workspaces? And are people engaged in the topic itself? Does it feel to them that it matters? That's a good thing, because when you're trying to manage culture, yes, you're trying to manage it towards a destination, but you're also trying to manage to make the culture matter per se as a topic. And then I think, to me, the ultimate test of whether a culture has been shifted is when in conversation people eventually tell you it's just the way it is around here. And the system has become the norm, and the new habits don't feel forced or practiced anymore. They are just the way it is.
I'm Aga Bajer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabajer.com/podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 55. Thanks for tuning in. Today my guest is the founder and CEO of QuayFive, Kirsty Bashforth. Kirsty is a graduate of Cambridge, and she had an impressive corporate career that includes 24 years at BP in commercial leadership and operational roles. And she recently wrote a book on managing organizational culture called Culture Shift. In this episode, Kirsty and I talk about why culture and strategy are equally important to business success. And she also shares the best ways to measure culture in an organization. She talks about how leaders can gain deeper understanding and awareness of the impact that they have on culture, and why it's so important to understand behavioral economics when you want to create culture change. Here we go. Here is Kirsty Bashforth. Kirsty, welcome to Culture Lab.
Thanks, Aya. Nice to be here.
I'm really, really happy that you made the time to come on the show, because your book, Culture Shift, and we'll talk about the book in detail in a moment, has really made an impression on me. And I think that we need more guides and more books like that to help our listeners evolve their cultures and work on their cultures. So thank you for being with us.
That's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And so before we dive into the conversation, could you just briefly introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, so my name is Kirsty Bashforth. I'm based out of the UK, but work globally. I run a company called QuayFive, which advises CEOs and others on how to manage their organizational culture. I'm also a board director on a number of public limited companies and family-owned and private equity businesses. And I previously spent 24 years in a management executive position at BP.
Wonderful. So, as you know, probably maybe listening to other episodes of Culture Lab, we explore our guests' influences, childhood influences, to try and see how culture has an impact on our lives and who we become as adults. So clearly, I want to ask you the same question as well. So what were these early childhood influences for you, and how did they shape you as a person?
Yeah, that's a really quite a deep question, isn't it? I was born and brought up on a small island called the Isle of Man. And I do think that's made a difference to sense of identity. It's 50 kilometers by 30 kilometers. And so you either look inwards, which is quite small, or you look very much outwards. And I've always looked outwards. I'm fascinated by the rest of the world, as well as my strong sense of identity. So that's definitely been an influence. I've come from a family that values working hard and values when you're advised that something's too difficult, you just try again a different way, and that you believe in yourself that it's doable. And it's not about shooting for the stars. It's doable because to do a good job, you'll break through and get to do the next step and know what you want to do. So that's always been quite a strong value of mine. And a third one was probably out of a bit of negative experience was when I was at school. I was a bit of a misfit, really. And I ended up feeling a bit left out or quite on the sidelines. And so I'm very conscious in all of my work that you can't assume things about people. You have to understand why they are as they are, what they do, and don't sort of use sweeping generalizations about people, because you might miss out on what the essence of that real person is, and that everybody has something truly special and truly exceptional within them, and it may not all be mainstream, but everybody has a special talent. So those are some of the things that I think have shaped me.
Oh, this is so wonderful. And I have to say that I can definitely relate to growing up in an isolated place, not because I grew up on an island, but I grew up in the communist Poland. So we were really isolated politically, for sure. And I think what can happen in those situations is exactly what you said. So you either become very inwards oriented, or you become extremely curious about what's behind that curtain, whatever the curtain is. And I've seen this common thread really running through all the interviews, that a lot of people I talk to that end up being fascinated by culture, they had similar experiences. So this is so fascinating. And I have to say, I find your parents super progressive, because it's almost like they had this growth mindset implanted into you very early on. Carol Dweck talks about how important it is for parents to tell their children that it's not about being perfect. It's not about having talent. It's about just trying again and again to get it right. And it seems like you got that from your family, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And both my parents always worked full time. So I suppose I had a role modeling of this is how you get on in the world. You work hard and earn your crust.
Yeah, totally. And I can also relate, and I think it's such an important experience, to being a misfit and being someone who's on the margins of a group, and then what perspective that gives you. And so now I think it makes sense to me why you ended up on this path that you are today. It does make sense, 100%. But before you get to this area of culture, organizational culture, you spent 24 years, as you said, at BP. And initially it was pursuing a career in commercial leadership and in operations. And I think that's certainly more than enough time to develop a reality-based point of view on what are the biggest challenges for organizations like BP or small organizations as well. And I'm particularly curious about your point of view. What are the challenges that lie at the crossroads of people and business issues based on your experience in the business?
I mean, as you say, yeah, pretty much all of my career was commercially focused, and I do think that gave me a very good understanding of what it takes to manage culture. Because one of those really tricky intersections is often I observe organizations viewing culture as separate to business. Yeah. And, if I have a pet peeve about how people hold culture, it's that they hold it separately. Businesses are run by people. I mean, increasingly there are algorithms, but we do have to program those algorithms. So there are algorithms, there are machines, but behind that is people programming and maintaining them. So to think of culture as separate to business is an anathema. Culture and the way we think, act, decide, behave as people in whatever we do drives that business delivery. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges for organizations is, first of all, to think culture is a core part of business. It is core part of the operating rhythm, because as adults, we turn up to work and we have free minds, and we cannot assume that just everybody thinks exactly the same, does exactly the same. So we have to engender a culture to get people moving in the same direction or an aligned direction to deliver the business we need. So thinking of culture and business separately is the first challenge, I think, really, that people struggle with, because too often, I see culture as held as soft, and yet culture is hard-edged, as well as incentivizing. It's got to matter, and if somebody really cannot align with the culture, then they need to choose to go or be asked to go. So those are some of the real struggles, I think, that organizations have to tackle, even when they're thinking about this topic to start with.
I can't tell you how important I consider this message, because this is exactly what I see as well in my work, that culture is still perceived to be something separate from the business. And one thing that I personally still struggle with is understanding what stands in the way of companies and senior executives to embrace this idea that culture, as you say, is an integral part of the business, and it has to be treated as such. Is it a matter of awareness? Is it a matter of lack of know-how? What do you think stands in the way?
Do you know, I think a number of things, and I might pick 4. First one is it can appear intangible and imprecise. So a lot of people, when we're running business, we deal in a lot of data, a lot of key performance indicators, a lot of financials, and we're able to provide precision and credibility through that precision of what we're talking about and how we're achieving. And a lot of people struggle with, well, how do I measure culture and how do I talk about it? And how do you know it's there? And so this intangibility can put people off, and it can almost be used as an excuse as well. I can't measure it, therefore it's not important. A second one is, it would be so much simpler, wouldn't it, if we just dealt in the old methods of hierarchy and were able to instruct people to do things, and just said, do as you're asked or else you're fired. That's not the way the world works now, and we're increasingly in flatter leadership structures. And as a result, people do struggle with, well, how do I work my way around to incentivize that person to do what I want? I'd much rather just tell them what to do. There, I've told them what to do, it's done. And so they struggle with that. A third one would be, a lot of leaders have really good EQ, that sense of empathy. And some leaders don't, and they struggle with that. I mean, we all have some of it. But how many of us are willing to spend the time trying to understand where the other person is coming from? And unless we value that time needs to be spent, we can ride roughshod over what's motivating people, and again, struggle to get going on this culture topic.
Yeah.
And then a fourth one that I think is really, really important is to shift a culture, to manage a culture. All of us as leaders have to realize that we cast the longest shadow in any culture, good or bad, because we all know as humans that we try to, consciously or unconsciously, emulate the behavior of the person that we see, that we want to follow, or that we are following, or that we see as successful. And so the most difficult thing for a leader is to put the mirror up to themselves and recognize what their behavior is and how it is impacting a culture. So all of these 4 elements make it quite uncomfortable for a leader to kick off going, let's look at culture. It just feels very difficult and very a position of vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's unpack what you've just shared with us, and let's start with the first one, because you said it clearly is something that is intangible, or at least it feels this way. And so there is a high level of discomfort. How do we deal with this? How can we measure this? So what do you have to say to that? Can we measure culture? How do we measure culture? And how can you follow progress on how the culture is evolving and whether whether it's having an impact on the business and what sort of impact it's having?
So I think you can definitely measure progress. To say we can measure culture precisely, I think, is stretching it too far. And I would always talk about using a mixture of data, quantitative data, and a mixture of qualitative data, and looking for sort of proxies that give you an example that the culture is progressing. So, first point, yes, you can measure it. Don't get tied up in precision because it isn't precise. It's human behavior that is constantly shifting and adjusting according to context and signals. So don't over fixate on specific measurement, and we can end up getting too scientific. I would also be clear what part of the system you're measuring. Too often in culture, we lay out a set of culture expectations, and then we just jump into let's measure whether the behavior is changing, which is a lagging indicator. To me, when you're trying to shift a culture, you're trying to create new habits. Therefore, the thing to check on progress is the system shifting such that our habits will shift. It's a bit like when let's say I want to lose 5 kilos of weight over the next 3 months. I could just keep going on the scales every day, but unless something is changing in the way I'm living my life, whatever weight I lose tomorrow may be put back on the following day. So really what I should be tracking is, what food am I buying? Am I doing more or less exercise? So the things inside my system of the way I live my life. And that's how I would look at measuring culture for the first, good couple of cycles. What is shifting inside that system to make the outcome of the behavior you want inevitable? I would also be clear when you're looking at things of distinguishing between quick wins, those things you go, that's a real win, that's great. And it could be an individual posts the values on their email signature and you go, yeah, everything's changing. Well, it's a great quick win that people are engaging with this new expected culture, but it's not a new habit in anything in necessarily the way they're behaving. So let's distinguish between what's a quick win and what really is a fundamental change of habit, which could be we now take account of the way we work and the way we behave as part of somebody's performance every year. And it's rated and paid according to that. That's sort of a habit that becomes structural in the system. But a great way to really test long-term whether things have changed are a couple of things. Listen for language. Listen out for what's the chat. Are the words that you're expecting, the tone of the behavior thrown up through that language? Are you hearing it in the corridors or in the workspaces? And are people engaged in the topic itself? Does it feel to them that it matters? That's a good thing, because when you're trying to manage culture, yes, you're trying to manage it towards a destination, but you're also trying to manage to make the culture matter per se as a topic. And then I think, to me, the ultimate test of whether a culture has been shifted is when in conversation people eventually tell you it's just the way it is around here. And the system has become the norm, and the new habits don't feel forced or practiced anymore. They are just the way it is. Now, that's also one of the most vulnerable times, because complacency can set in and we need to go, hang on a minute, that's just the way it is that still the way it needs to be? So there's quite a lot in measurement, and I realise we're sort of trying to unpack issues and I'm getting deeper into them. But the short answer is you can measure it. You won't measure it precisely. Measure the system, listen for language, and mix quantitative, qualitative, and some proxies to give you a sense.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that it really addresses one of the major objections that we often hear, because clearly, as we know, our whole systems in organizations and businesses are based on metrics. So it's really important to have something to be able to know whether we are making progress in the right direction. So we unpacked the first one, and I want us to go to the last one as well. And that was what you mentioned about the shadow of the leader being the longest, and really having to have the courage and daring to look in the mirror and face reality of how we as leaders are influencing the culture that our teams are experiencing. And when you ask people who are on teams, they will very often say that indeed our leader is not entirely aware and their impact is not always the one that they desire to have on the team. And I think one of the very classical examples, and I talk to these leaders almost every day, is, I want my people to take initiative. I want our employees to be empowered. This is a very frequently used word. And then at the same time, when you sit down with an executive team in a meeting or in a workshop and you see that leader interacting with others, you will immediately realize that they're the ones who are cutting people off and who are jumping in and judging ideas before people have a chance to express them. So I know it was a long introduction to my question, but my question to you is, what would you say is the best way for leaders to get quality feedback on what they are actually doing versus what they think they are doing and the impact that they think they have?
It's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because if it was an easy answer and a comfortable answer, we'd all be doing it all the time. And it's sort of, you and I wouldn't need to have this conversation. I've often found that it takes, this sounds a circular argument, the very leaders who need to understand how to look in the mirror are the very ones who struggle to. And the ones who realize the need to look in the mirror are the ones who actually don't because they're already doing it. So it's how do you break through that? And often the difficult thing to say is it takes quite often some sort of a burning platform, that old sort of change phrase, to break into that before some leaders will recognize that it's unavoidable. They have to look in the mirror because they have to look at every aspect of the business because something's not right. And therefore, they are more open to being challenged on anything because at all costs, they want the business to win. Well, not at all costs, not at any cost, but you know what I mean. That their main aim is the business needs to win. So when it comes to a crisis or an intervention, or they are forced into the position, then they will look in the mirror. We don't always want to come to that situation, but the stark reality of culture work is I often find it takes that, some big disruption for people to be able to look in the mirror. I think one way to do it when it's not a massive disruption is peer-to-peer. It can be very impactful when your peers give you feedback, and that can, but it has to be done privately. It's never a winning strategy to give a leader feedback on themselves personally in a room of lots of other people. That's not going to be a winning way because they will feel personally undermined, threatened, humiliated, embarrassed. So I would always do it in private, peer-to-peer. And I would, sometimes it comes down to finding out what really incentivizes that person. And this may sound difficult, but, if it comes to it, make it part of their bonus, make it part of their way to progress. And just say, look, this is part of your targets. These are part of your KPIs. Because if that's what really motivates somebody to get going, again, it's going to where that person is, to understand why they're where they are, and then to motivate them according to how they naturally get incentivized. But it's not easy to break into. It's not easy.
No, absolutely not. I think it's really one of the main obstacles that organizations face, that the leaders are not entirely aware of the impact that they have on the culture. And they sense high frustration with the culture without realizing that they are part of the problem. Unfortunately, they are not part of the solution. So I think
you can do it. You can do it through, you can try a little bit through engagement surveys. I mean, you can put in questions that says, my leader listens, and there's all sorts of questions, but then it's about doing something with them as an organization and making that response matter, because a lot of this is about trust between the team member and the team leader, trust between the team leader and their peers, trust between the team leader and the system. So that's a sort of tactical way you can get going, as long as an organization you're willing to then follow through, that this response from the organization really is going to matter in the team leader's world.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's absolutely critical. So, as I've mentioned before, you've had recently this book published. It's called Culture Shift, a practical guide to managing organizational culture. So, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
And, I'm writing my second book myself at the moment. So I'm painfully aware of the fact that in order to embark on something like that, and especially to finish a project like a book, you need a lot of motivation and you really need to be passionate about the topic. So I'm curious, what has driven you to write the book?
It was a number of things, actually. I suppose because, well, in a way, it was cathartic. I had a lot of experience of leading work in culture, and I sort of wanted to get it all down in one place so that I didn't lose some of the essence of it. That was one thing. There was another, which was, I formed my business 3.5 years ago, and it's a very helpful thing to have a book that underpins your business model, your business approach. So there was the business side of it. There was also, it was a bit of a lifelong bucket list. I'll write a book. Oh, no, I never will. Oh, I have been able to. And when the opportunity arose, which was, and I'll tell you that story, I thought, well, let's just go for it. I didn't know how it would work out, but a number of people had always said to me since I led the work at BP, you should write a book about this because you're doing it differently and it seems to be working. And I always said, well, that's fine, but how do you write a book? I don't want to self-publish and I don't even know how to get going. And a colleague one day sat down, we were having breakfast, and she said, you should write a book. I said, yes, I know. And she said, well, my daughter's a book agent. And I had a coffee with her. And after half an hour, she said, I think you've got this book in you. And we went backwards and forwards across the next couple of months of her saying, write 500 words and why the book, why now? And got together enough words to put to a publishing house. And I had a contract with her and off we went. And Bloomsbury picked it up. And then I got the sort of shock of, they want 75,000 words by December the 14th, at which point you go, pardon? I was expecting only 50,000 and I've only got 10. And off we went. And then I structured it in a typical old-fashioned corporate way with my spreadsheet and word count and daily word count. It was really, if you saw my Excel spreadsheet, it's quite dull. But it got me organized. But it was, and once I got into it, I started thinking, I'll never have that many words. Then you add the stories and you realize when you sit down and explain stuff, you've got a lot of stuff in your head that you think you explain well, but actually when you write it down, you have to spend a lot of more words explaining it because it's so within you. It's just your practice and how you've worked. So those are the sort of reasons. Did it differently, wanted it for my business, wanted to get it down, sort of cathartic, and the opportunity arose.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I was kind of smiling as you were describing this because it was exactly the same word count for us when I was writing the book with David Clutterbuck and David Megginson, 75,000 words. And I was thinking, oh my God, I will never be able to say so much on the topic. And then we ended up with much more. And it was about how do you trim it down so that it fits the 75,000. So I can totally relate to that. So this is wonderful. And, I've read the book. I think that indeed you have a different point of view on what culture is and how it should be approached. So I want us to kick off talking about the book with a really open question, which is, because you said people were telling you, your approach to culture is different. So how would you describe that different point of view that you present in the book?
So the whole book has 3 key messages. The first one is that I treat culture and strategy as equal partners. So I know the classic, the opening line of the book talks about culture eats strategy for breakfast, but then I go on to say that's the adage, but actually I think they are equal and need to be treated as equal. That's the first thing. Because from what I said at the start of our conversation about businesses are delivered by people, so they have to work together, but equally. The second thing is that the culture must align to deliver the strategy. It's no use having a strategy that's all about innovation and disruption if you have a culture that is all about operational excellence and stability and predictability. And the third thing about doing it differently is to manage and shift a culture. I have a degree in economics, and I became fascinated by behavioral economics. And I think about nudges, and I think about going to where people are because of their different rationales, their different contexts, their different ambitions, and never assuming everybody will make the same decision because they have the same data, because we won't. And that's the third element of the book, to say how you manage it is in that way. So those are the three things in terms of doing it differently. And the behavioral economics thing is really at the core of this. So it's not about traditional project management, because this isn't a project. You wouldn't consider strategy as a project. You'd consider it as an ongoing element of the business. And you wouldn't have, therefore, one person doing it and implementing the project. You would have an air traffic controller or a conductor of an orchestra who ensures that they can see what's happening in the system, but everybody in the system is doing the work to shift the culture. So those are some of the elements of the different approach.
That's fantastic, and thank you for laying it out so clearly for us. So let's, my favorite part of the book is your focus on behavioral economics, and I'm using a lot of principles from behavioral economics in my work in culture as well. So I'd love to chat with you a little bit about this. But before our listeners tune out, because behavioral economics sounds way too fancy or complicated, let's define it for our listeners.
Doesn't it?
Yeah. Let's explain how it can come in handy when you're trying to create real sustainable behavior change. Because at the end of the day, I think for a lot of our listeners, the reason that they listen to the podcast is they want to figure out, how do I make my team members behave differently? So how, first of all, talk to us a little bit about what behavioral economics is, and then how you can use it to your advantage in creating culture change in an organization.
Yeah. So if I put it in real, practical terms, it's understanding that. So traditional economics would say, faced with the same data, people will make the same choices.
Yeah, right.
But we are human beings, and so we don't. And if economists had, traditional economics was right, then the economies would be completely predictable. But they're not, because we all operate in a slightly different way. So behavioral economics says that is not the case. You may do different things because you hold the value of something differently than somebody else. So let's say I buy a lamp from IKEA and I've paid €100 for it. And somebody comes along the next day and says, I will give you €150 for that lamp because it's wonderful. And I don't want to have to go to the store. And the logical economist would say, wow, that's a 50% uplift. They will sell it to them. The behavioral economist says, well, they've bought it for a reason, because it fits in their house and they've probably been looking for it for ages, and it may hold some emotional value. And overall, when you add up all of the elements of why they bought it, it may be worth €500-600 to them, or it may be worth a number that you can't put a finger on. So, that doesn't stack up logically. But what you're doing is going to understand all of the motivations of where people are and the background as to why they make the decisions they do today. So that makes, so some people will look and go, oh, blimey, behavioral economics, well, that's just unmeasurable and it's just, it's chaos. But the essence is, go to where the people are today and understand why they are today, rather than putting your own assumptions of just logic on. So if I take culture, we might say, well, I've laid out that there are, I'd like a culture of pink. but I think the culture today is green. So I'm just going to tell everybody that it's logical that if we have a culture of pink, we will win in business and we will have a safer operation. And therefore, I'm telling you, please behave in a pink way and no longer in a green way. We're humans, and the culture, and the most critical thing on behavioral economics around culture is to understand really why is the culture is as it is today. Why is it green? And a lot of things will be going on. It may be people have come in from different companies and have different backgrounds and ways of working that worked for them, and nobody has yet given them enough incentives or boundaries or rationale as to why they should do anything differently because it's working.
Yeah.
They may have people they like working with. They may look at certain leaders and presume they're going to make certain decisions, even though they say they don't. So act into that situation rather than not. So behavioral economics in culture really says get to grips with all the aspects of your culture today and understand the background to why it is as it is today, rather than just assuming if I tell people the culture needs to be pink and I think it's green today, it'll be pink if I shout loudly enough, stick some KPIs on it and order people to do it.
Absolutely.
You have to understand what breaks down their habits from today to make them need to create new habits for tomorrow.
Absolutely. And I think, the funny thing is that very often people will actually agree that a pink culture would be so much better, and they really mean it. And yet they still behave in a green way. Because
sometimes they don't know how to behave in a different way, haven't been shown. But also, we are adults and we will take the space that there is with our own free will until somebody either shrinks that space or puts us into another space or incentivizes us to be in another space. And therefore, that's what makes culture quite hard-edged. Because it isn't just about persuasion and marketing and campaigns. It is about making the way we work and the space we're operating in different, such that we have to do different habits in order to fulfill our roles, be successful, or even remain in the company.
Absolutely. So it's all about creating systems and structures and architecture around it so that we make engaging in the desired behaviors, in the pink behaviors easier, and engaging in green behaviors more difficult, basically.
Yeah, and making it as much as you can inevitable. So some of those structures may be around who you recruit and how you recruit, the performance management and what is valued in, if somebody a good performer, how do you define what goes into that performance? Is it just what you do, or is it how you do? Is it you're going to get rewarded for demonstrating a pink culture rather than a green culture? So it's in some of these hard-edged structures. Now, I don't want listeners to think that it's just about structure. You do have to back it up with consistent messaging, with an environment that feels and looks and symbolizes the culture, the pink culture rather than the green culture. And so it's a whole load of things that are hard-edged as well as empathetically edged and emotional edged that pull the whole system forward. It isn't just I'll do some structures and we're done. Totally. It's got to have a human element as well.
But, for me, I think what's so interesting about this and then embracing behavioral economics and shifting culture is starts from what Ed Schein says about where culture really comes to life, which is, he says, through collective experiences that people have that lead them to develop certain assumptions and beliefs and so on and so forth. And so clearly it is going to be behavioral eventually, but I think in order to be able to create those collective experiences, creating those structures and processes, it helps for people to engage within that framework and consistently have an experience that manifests that the pink behaviors are more effective and rewarded and desired and da-da-da. So basically, there is a positive payoff.
Yeah, there's a lot of storytelling to build confidence and build examples, because I often see some people seem passive or seem not engaged, but it's because they don't have the confidence that, one, that this effort might stick and carry on, or that two, they don't want to look stupid by doing something and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
They don't want to. They do want to be successful, but they don't want to be the first mover in case it's not quite right or somebody else doesn't reward them in something that they think should be rewarded. So stories are really important, as we said at the start, the leadership behaviors. And I don't mean that leaders need to be perfect role models of the culture they're defining from day one. That's impossible. That would just be sort of, ridiculously fake, actually. But they do need to show that they are really making the effort, that it really matters, that it matters that they are trying as well, because authenticity in this from leaders who are, after all, employees, who are facing the same habit changes as everybody else. Authenticity is really vital here. It's commitment and effort are more than this sort of blanket definition of leadership role modeling. But the stories and the leadership effort together really help that collective experience, I agree, to gain momentum.
Yeah. Love it. I think a great way of illustrating how a culture shift happens is through a story, actually, of an organization that experienced it. So I was wondering whether you could give us a brief example of a journey of an organization that you worked with, so that we can see the whole process and how it played out.
Yeah, it's I'll give you an example of a particular process in an organization that showed the shift, because often I work with organizations who, and you're in their context, so they may only need part of the journey. And it's rare that it's probably only when I was doing it in BP that we went from sort of start to finish, the whole maturity. So different companies either need a boost or they're stuck in the middle of something. And it's rare that I go all the way through, because my aim is that they are equipped then to carry it on. Sure. So let me give you an example of one particular process. And for those readers, it's in the book as well. Performance management, and I've mentioned it a couple of times, is one of the biggest, noisiest elements that you can do to really show your organization that culture is going to matter and that it's going to matter as part of performance. So this organization started off and said, we're really committed to this. Let's make sure that the way we define our culture, which is through our values, we are going to put as part of people's performance management. So no longer is it going to be fine that we just rate people. They've either made the most money or delivered the most objectives or provided the best safety environment or whatever it is, or delivered, launched the best product. That in itself is not good enough, because the way they have done this and the way they have behaved is going to be vital as an element in that performance. So in the first year, we, patted ourselves on the back. I advised them to put this in, and we updated into one form for everybody and made it very clear with a load of communications. This is what's now going to happen. What you do and how you do it are going to be very important. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Got all the results back. Everybody filled all the forms in. And what we saw in the results was that a lot of people had written down about how people had behaved. But the behavior they were talking about was not related to the behavior that the company had laid out as expected. And so, again, behavioral economics, people had said, well, I'll take some of it, but you haven't really told me, you haven't made it inevitable that I have to track these behaviors that you've said. So I'm going to track the behaviors that I think are important. So tick box had been, how we behave is important in performance, cross to the box of follow the behavior the company wants. Second year, we said, well, how do we make that inevitable in the system? Okay, make the form online and make it a drop-down box on the behaviors that are required, so that the only ones that you can track against are the ones from the drop-down box, which are the ones the company has laid out as expected. So major step forward, we're channeling in. First year, okay, behavior is important in performance. Second year, the behavior we want is important in performance. But still, people were sort of ticking the box and weren't really calibrating teams against each other. Only in the third year did the conversations then properly happen, and in a mature way, where a group of leaders would come together and review, let's say, 10 other leaders and say, well, that person's delivered really, really well. And others would challenge to say, well, they have, but I have feedback that their behaviors on this, this, and this weren't great. So some were pulled down, some were pulled back up. And you started to get the real traction on behavior matters in performance, then the behavior that we want matters in performance, and then it really matters against each other. So that's one thing. And it took 3 years as a big organization, but that really, it helped us see that even when you think you're making a change, actually there's another layer underneath it about that change that takes a bit longer.
Totally. And I don't think that it's necessarily only about the size of the organization, but there's also, I think, this maturation curve that organizations need to go through to really embrace these ideas. And it does take time. So this, one of my pet peeves when it comes to a conversation about culture is that some people who call themselves culture experts or culture consultants, they promise their clients almost overnight changes. And I don't think that this is a fair thing to say to organizations, that you can have sustainable culture change in a really short period of time. I think what you can have is positive impact on your business by driving certain behaviors, but for it to make it stick and make it sustainable, it does take a longer period of time.
Completely agree with you. I mean, it is about changing habits.
Yeah.
It's not just a marketing campaign. This is what we do day in, day out, that we know is the right way to make decisions and behave and act for this business. And that doesn't happen overnight. We are free-thinking individuals who have formed our own habits in the way that we have just got on in work. And to shift those, whether it's even to tweak them, let alone change them radically, it can take a long time. And sometimes it's the tweaks that are more difficult. The radical change can sometimes be the more simple one, because it's easier to spot the huge difference you need.
Time for your questions.
Hi, Aga. This is Alison McTavish from Switzerland.
Hi, this is Dale Hintz. I'm submitting a question to the Culture Lab.
Hi, Aga. I just want to say thank you so much for doing the podcast.
I have a question for Culture Lab.
Hello, my name is Morten Abbey from Denmark.
Hi, Ed. This is Tim Coupler.
Hi, I'm Kostas. I have a question for you, Michael.
I'd love to hear your answer. Thank you.
Thanks for entertaining my question.
Hi, I'm Ansha from Mauritius. So my question would be, how do we initiate or get culture shift at board level when it is family-run businesses? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Ansha, for the question. This is a really difficult one, as you are. That's probably the reason why you've asked it. One thing I think about when any business is trying to focus on culture, and at the board level or whatever level, is you will never, or very rarely, get everybody in the same team to agree to the same extent. So I typically find 1/3, let's say you've got a team of 12 people at the top of a business. 4 people typically will be up for change. 4 typically will be really resistant to change, and 4 will be sort of in the middle, slightly passive. And that's a proxy. It's an approximation, but I find that. So the first thing I would say is, don't try and expect to get everybody on board before you start, and even don't expect to have everybody on board at all ever, because that's just human nature. Not everybody will. But if you could find 1 or 2 people quietly and privately who really want this shift, and you can gather 2 or 3 of them together, that's an important start. But work with them very closely. Then the other thing I would do is say, almost quietly, give them a couple of tasks which aren't called culture change, but do require a shift in behavior to get different results. And don't ask them to signal them to the rest of the organization, but suggest that they do these things, then track the business results, and then go back into the senior conversation and say, we did this. And then when asked, well, how did it make a difference? They give that evidence of, well, it was because we behaved differently. So you're building it up from evidence. But it's not just a family. It's not just a family owned, and it's on boards. This is sort of the world over, and business models over. Increasingly, public limited companies are getting pressure from outside, from investors, from all sorts of places. So it makes it slightly simpler because the other owners of the company are forcing this. But I would also see if you could get some new recruits in front of the board and the family business to provide evidence and thoughts on why people joined the company, and why they might choose to leave. It's very difficult in a family-owned business because it almost feels like a child. It's like it is one of their family, the business. And so you have to tread a very careful line between appropriate and constructive challenge and basically criticizing a family member, or attacking the family jewels. So it can be quite difficult, but I would approach it that way. Don't try and get everybody. Work quietly with a couple of people who you think really want to do something here, and give them some tasks and some evidence to be able to share with their own other family members to start to get going. But I think it can be sometimes more difficult on the family side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love this idea, though, of finding and building alliances within those environments, because there will be, I think, at least one person who is more forward-looking and who sees the need for change. And them being a family member, of course, they have leverage with the rest of the other family members as well. And clearly there are power dynamics to think about. And if this is not the most powerful person in the family, then of course it will be challenging for them. But nevertheless, I think this obstacle of this being a family business can also work towards your advantage, because I think people consider one another really seriously, and each and every person within the business has an important leverage. So finding and building those alliances, I think, is super important. And another thing that I found also working with family businesses is that if you can speak to the need of preserving the family name and building legacy, that really resonates with family-owned businesses and the owners, because, as you said, it's like their baby. There is such a strong emotional attachment to the business. So if they can see how shifting culture can help their family name, their family business to be more enduring, more respected, whatever is important and is already within the set of their values, that will definitely resonate. So again, I think it's just about building a case for change, really.
Yeah, exactly. And it's again back to the sort of behavioral economics. What's in it for them?
Yeah.
What's motivating them?
Yeah.
And in any, unless you're in such a burning platform situation that it's unavoidable, you have to deal with this now, and it doesn't matter whether who's breaking whose eggs. It really is finding out what's really going to tick people's boxes. And I've found often in culture work, this sounds a bit Machiavellian, but it's how do I make that person a hero?
Yeah.
Through giving them something quietly. It's not about me, and it's not about me being seen to be giving them something. It's about me working quietly with them on something that they are going to be seen to have been brilliant at. And through that, we'll be helping to signal the shift that we need. So it's really stepping into their shoes about how they see success happening, and building it from there.
I love it, Kirsty. And I think that it really speaks to the basic principles of almost storytelling, business storytelling, because you want, when you try to convince someone, you want to make them the hero, as you say, and you position yourself as a guide at best. So someone who can show them the way to have that success that is important for them, as you say. So resonating with what motivates them and what drives them. I love that. I think that, well, I would really like to hear from you, Ansha, and let us know how it went and whether you had some success and some progress with those issues. So please reach out to us. I'm sure that Kirsty and I, for sure, we would like to see how that's going for you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move to the rapid fire questions. And this section is really brief. It's just 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask you 5 questions. And the idea is that you'll answer all these questions in under 2 minutes.
Whoa. Okay.
All right, let's go.
Catching my breath.
So the first one is, what is your definition of organizational culture?
Totality of behaviors, decisions, actions, habits, perceptions, assumptions in the business. So the way it is around here.
And what are the signs that the company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
Potential lack of engagement, commentary on exit interviews, lack of compliance, even look at safety performance. It's not always just the financials. Look further up in the system for the leading indicators.
Do you have any companies that you admire for their culture? And if yes, why?
It's less about the companies and their particular culture and more about whether they are consistently focusing on culture as a point of their core business. And so a couple of examples might be over time, consistent focus on it, a big organization, IBM. Again, I'm not talking about whether their culture is good or not, it's whether they focus on it well. And then a small company in the UK called Timpson, which is wonderful. And I would really encourage people to research it.
I love it, and I 100% agree with it. Next one. What books on culture or on leadership would you recommend to our listeners, and what are the books that you are learning from about culture and leadership?
I am probably the worst person to ask this because I do most of my reading through Twitter, Fast Company, and generally online. And so don't tend to read long business books. So I read short articles, and then I pick it up via observations in real life.
And what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow so that they can build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Really be honest to dig into what you think the culture properly is today, rather than glossing over it, and find quietly some like-minded peers who might be up for doing something together, possibly stealthily.
Love it. So any closing remarks, Kirsty? What would you like to leave our listeners with?
2 things. If you are going to manage culture, think differently about it. Really go to where people are and don't work it as a project. And the second thing, actually 3 things I'm going to say. The second thing is culture is difficult. It's not precise. And if you are facing difficulties and finding it's messy and challenging, that's fine because it should be, but it doesn't mean it's not manageable. It absolutely is. You just have to do it differently. And the third thing I would absolutely finish on is this is not a group hug. This is hard edge business.
So that's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And last thing that I want to ask you is if our listeners would like to learn more about you, your work, your writing, what are the best places online or offline for them to go to?
So a number of places. They can go to my website, www.QuayFive.com. They can follow me on Twitter at Kirsty Bashforth or at QuayFive Ltd. And they can find me on LinkedIn at Kirsty Bashforth. It's quite helpful having my name because I appear to be the only one on the internet.
Yes, this is what I've noticed. This is amazing. Wonderful. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much. A lot of learning. I really appreciate your different approach to shifting culture. There's a lot that people will learn from your book. I can guarantee that, having read the book. So I just want to recommend it again. Thank you so much for making the time and have a great afternoon.
Great. And thanks very much for the opportunity.
I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott.
content editor.
Sound producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabajer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabajer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. And now it's time for the preview of the upcoming episode. My next guest is Siobhan Mchale, a culture change specialist. Siobhan has worked across 4 continents, helping thousands of leaders to create more agile and more productive workplaces. She has been on the inside as the executive in charge of change in a series of large multinational organizations, and will be talking about everything she has learned in her long and successful career. In this short preview of our conversation, she talks about how the key to changing behaviors at work lies in reframing roles.
So there are 3 key levers for changing or shaping or influencing behavior, or that influence our behavior. The first is our instincts, so the instincts to survive, or the instinct to eat, or the instinct to protect one's offspring. And these are very hardwired, but they do influence our behavior. But again, very hard to change your instinctual response. The second one, as you mentioned, Aga, is our personality. So our personality, whether we're outgoing or we're gregarious or we're generous or we have a trigger-haired temper, some of these things are personality-driven and, again, deeply wired and quite hard to change. And some would also argue, well, what right do we even have to try and change people's personality and who they are at work? And, what right do we have to even ask people to do that? But then the third way, and I think, sometimes the easier way, is to reframe the role.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.